computer science at Oklahoma State University. But for us, what is more important is his very deep knowledge of Indic texts and Indic systems of knowledge, and how he has been able to articulate that in the sciences, in common Indic conferences. So this synthesis of his brilliant work in computer science, together with his understanding of Vedantic concepts. So the Vedanta conference, as you know, is one of the very rare conferences where you will have somebody speaking on ethical issues in a text, followed by foundations of physics. So, and the reason this doesn't make any problem, this is no problem for us, is because we look at Vedanta as such an umbrella architecture of how we put different things in a knowledge system. So in that sense, there is absolutely no problem from our side. I mean, others may have some issues. So Professor Kak will speak on Vedanta and the foundations of physics. And if I can just give for those of you who may not have a physics background, I mean, we can classify physics into, let's say, starting with mechanics, where we looked at objects, we looked at how they moved, how they related to other objects. So that was classical mechanics today. Then came ENM, electricity and magnetism, where one had to further one's scope because the traditional laws of mechanics weren't applicable. And that served us very well. And so as physics progressed, so did scientists feel, many scientists feel that there was no need for religion. Religion was something which came because people didn't know, and they assigned all these kind of supernatural forces. And now that we understand, there's no need. But then came, at the dawn of the 20th century, some very fundamental issues in physics, which were not addressable by either mechanics or ENM. And so came the platform for quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics was a revolutionary thought because it, in a way, completely violated the original structure that was made to build mechanics and ENM. And in quantum mechanics, as Subhashji will explain to you, there were some fundamental questions, and Vedanta contributed to some people articulating a principle or a set of principles which they themselves told that they were inspired by Vedanta. And it also fits very well with the Vedantic system. So quantum mechanics has helped us a lot in understanding. But today, again, physics kind of is in a bind, because if we look at the universe, for example, what is known as baryonic matter, I mean, the matter that we typically understand, that baryonic matter is only about 5% of the universe. So you see, what is the rest? Well, there are all these concepts of dark energy and dark matter. And physicists till today, I mean, they have many theories, but still today they have not been able to explain these. And the most fundamental of them is, what is the role of consciousness? Because we saw with quantum mechanics that quantum mechanics became, I mean, the reason quantum mechanics had to be invented was because when we look at the observer, until quantum mechanics came in, the observer had no role whatsoever in physics. Quantum mechanics looked at the centrality of the observer. And now we are maybe one more step ahead in trying to see what is the role of consciousness in all of this. So with that, Subhashji, over to you.
Thank you, Sukalyanji. Delighted to be a part of this year's Vedanta Congress, and especially happy that I had this opportunity to hear Rukmaniji once again. You know, I've known Rukmaniji for many, many years. Wonderful to have heard her great lecture. So let me just get started from where Sukalyan left off. Whole history of physics, which actually sits at the very bottom of the whole pyramid of science. If you invert this pyramid, at the bottom is physics, because from physics comes chemistry. You cannot explain chemistry without physics, and you cannot explain biology without chemistry. And then once you have a handle on biology, then you can go to brains and so on, and therefore or thereby hope to explain psychology or human nature or all other sciences that we have related to behavior. So physics is at the very bottom. And therefore, ideas in physics have set the agenda for philosophers to interpret their understanding of the other more involved sciences. Now, as Sukalyanji mentioned in the introduction, physics after the Newtonian revolution, where the universe was perceived as a system of objects interacting with each other through gravity and so on. After that, things went along fine until the late 1800s, when there were problems related to the very structure of atoms. And in the 1920s, the theory of quantum mechanics came along, which was able to convert all of that into a system which worked, and which has worked so beautifully that quantum mechanics is considered the deepest scientific theory ever. And quantum mechanics underlies everything. Now you see it also reflecting in technology. You cannot even do integrated circuits or computers without knowing quantum mechanics. Now, the interesting thing is that one of the two creators of quantum mechanics was a Austrian Vedantist named Irwin Schrodinger. Now, Irwin Schrodinger, when he wrote his autobiography in the 1950s, he claimed that the central idea of quantum mechanics came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma. In other words, that this cell, this Atman is the entire cosmos, gave him the idea, one of the two central ideas of quantum mechanics, that this single object is a superposition of all possibilities. You know, if I were to teach you, I do quantum mechanics myself. If I were to teach you quantum mechanics, there are only two principles. One is that the system is a superposition of all possibilities. And the second is that when you interact with the system, when you observe it, then you have access to only one of the many different mutually exclusive strands that constitute the state of the system. So, and that's called the collapse of the quantum state. Now, so to this extent, Vedanta, if one were to agree with Schrodinger, the creator of quantum mechanics, that the idea came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, then Vedanta has already played a very fundamental role in the development of science, of revolutionary science, which has changed the world in so many different ways. The second aspect of, or the second component, the one was superposition. The second component was interaction. When you have access to one of the possibilities, brings in the observer. So observer is also a part of quantum mechanics. So when does the observer do it? Does the observer have freedom to interact with the system? And therefore, is it also indirectly an explanation of consciousness? In fact, the orthodox interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, according to scholars, according to the best scholars, is perfectly consistent with Vedanta. That in the orthodox interpretation, you have two aspects to reality. One is the physical world, and the second is consciousness. And consciousness as reflected in the freedom that observers have to interact with the physical system, and the way they observe, the physical systems and interact with the system leads to the evolution of the universe in a particular way. So, but it also brings in paradoxes. Now, just as Rukmaniji was talking about ethical paradoxes, there are also fundamental paradoxes in physics and in all of science. And the paradox, for example, is if everything there is a system, then how does the human being, who is also a physical system, how does he come to have this quality of consciousness, or this category associated with his behavior, which gives him freedom? And how could consciousness, if it's a consequence of objective properties, be different from objects or a quality associated with objects itself? Because either you have to posit that consciousness is also objective or derived from objects, or if it isn't, and that goes back to an argument also to be found in Europe, to Leibniz, that there are two different categories, namely consciousness, conscious reality, and physical reality. But here, if consciousness is different from being objective, then how is consciousness able to change the physical system? Now, an answer to this was given in the 1970s by an Indian, great Indian physicist whom we all know, who used to be at the Vedanta congresses all the time, George Sudarshan. And George Sudarshan wrote a paper in the 1970s, and he showed mathematically that by observation alone, without expending any energy, a physical state can be steered to whatever state the observer wanted. So in other words, you can interact. The consciousness and physical system can interact. Of course, it doesn't answer the question, where does consciousness come in? Because that is positive. Now, this is a question which has been a part of the Vedantic or the Indian tradition for a very long time. And within the Vedanta tradition itself, people have asked, how is the deity able to influence the physical system, right? If there is rhythm, as Rukmaniji was talking about, there is rhythm, there are laws, there is order in physical reality and in moral reality. If there is order, then how can Ishvara, or how can the deity do anything? Isn't the deity redundant, right? And this question was answered way back, and in fact, it's a part of the entire Shaivite or Shakta tradition, or you can look at it from all Vaishnava tradition as well. And it was answered by the slogan, Drishti Srishtivada, that the deity through Drishti creates Srishti. So Drishti meaning observation, that the interaction, deity has not to physically become take a physical form to influence the universe. Through Drishti alone, through observation alone, or through Sankalpa alone, Srishti is created, which is perfectly consistent with the theory that George Sudarshan and his student advanced in the 1970s, which is called the quantum Zeno effect, that through observation you can influence the derivation of the universe. Now, what's interesting is that all of these thoughts or all of these strands go back in time as far back as you can choose to do so, and all the way back to the Rig Veda. Sometimes we see these as innovations, maybe in the 15th century, or Tantra, maybe in the 6th century, or Shaivism, maybe in the 2nd century. But the more you explore and you look at the beginnings of these strands, you find them already present in the Rig Veda. At least that's what I've found, and which is what I've written on very, very extensively. Let me just touch upon a few. Let's look at the tantric tradition, and you have, for example, the idea of the Sri Chakra or Sri Vidya, where you have a representation of the cosmos, the inner cosmos, in terms of Sri Chakra, where right in the middle, of course, now this represents the structure of the embodied consciousness, or the entire cosmos, and right in the middle, as a bindu is Shiva, as a bindu, because the more you look for it, it's infinitesimal. The more you look for consciousness, the more it recedes. The only way you can, as an embodied individual, find consciousness is through Prakriti. So is through reality, physical reality, and the reason in the Upanishads itself is that you have two vidyas, para and apara. Apara are the vidyas related to embodiments, which is what we have narratives on, which is what language is used to describe Rita, related to all these embodiments. And so that is all apara, and that's what all darshana in fact can be about. And therefore you have paradoxes or oppositions in relation to what does this darshana say and what does that darshana say, right? And why does one have to go back to one's intuition, as Rukmaniji was mentioning, is because intuition is closer to the para within us, the Atman within us, and that Atman is one for the entire reality. And so the para is the science of the experiencing self, and apara is what is experienced. So this is the division, and this division later on, for example, in Kashmir, which is where I'm from, is expressed in the idea in Kashmir Shaivism, is Shivoham, that each individual is Shiva, is consciousness, is Atman, right? So you can explore the reality by going within and examining what the Atman does. So that can open the whole mystery of the outside universe as well, because all of the outside universe, as well as all our theories about the outside universe, reside in our consciousness, right? Ultimately, everything is within our consciousness. So let's go back then to physics. What's happening in physics? Physics right now, just as there was a huge crisis in the 1920s, when one didn't quite know why doesn't the negative charged electron around the nucleus of the atom, which is positive, why doesn't it fall into the nucleus, right? Why is the atom stable? Which is why quantum mechanics had to be created and all those laws emerge. The crisis that there is now is because astronomers and cosmologists have discovered that all these galaxies are moving at these huge speeds, where, just as in the solar system, Mercury, which is closest to the sun, is going much faster than Venus, than Mars. The objects which are far apart because of gravitational law go slower than the objects which are close to the massive body, which is giving energy to the system. What they're discovering is that in these galaxies, these huge star objects far from the center of the galaxies are going at huge speeds, which cannot be explained either by Newton's law of gravitation or Einstein's law of gravitation, which is general theory of relativity. So this is one, and therefore what they've had to postulate is that maybe there is matter, huge amounts of matter, which we cannot see because there is no evidence at all of any kind for dark matter. But they have had to postulate it, that there must be some dark matter. Maybe these are black holes, huge, immense black holes, which are powering the motion of these stars at huge speeds, which otherwise you cannot explain because there is no There is no evidence, as far as we can see through our telescopes, or through not just visual telescopes or light telescopes, but also radio telescopes. You can interact with the cosmos in different ways. The second thing that emerged about 25 years ago, they discovered that while after the Big Bang, this is the 100-year-old theory, that the universe started expanding, the assumption was that if it's expanding, then slowly at some point, as the energy of the initial Big Bang dissipates, the expansion rate will slow down, right? But in the 1990s, they discovered just the opposite. They discovered that the expansion of the universe is accelerating. And this is, in many ways, a very scary thought. What it means is that all these stars will keep on going, and then the whole universe will die a cold death, right? Because, and then for that, they have had to postulate dark energy. That it's a dark energy, and once again, for which there is no evidence whatsoever. In fact, right now, it's assumed that 96% of the universe, if you were to explain whatever there is in the universe based on current laws of physics, 96% of the universe is dark matter and dark energy, 3.5% is interstellar gases, and only 0.5% is the observable or observed universe. And clearly this could not be true. This is exactly like what was happening 100 years ago. This could not be true, that there is no evidence whatsoever. So this is where, once again, Vedanta comes in. And let me situate this in a historical context. One of the darshanas from India, which speaks about the physical universe, of course, is Vaisheshika Sutra. Now, sadly, because after 1947, the Indians decided to completely separate themselves from India's own knowledge traditions, excepting, brave people like Rukmaniji who were doing philosophy and so on. But in the sciences prior to 1947, you look at the Indian great scientists who were as good as anybody in the world, like the Boses, J.C. Bose, S.N. Bose, C.V. Raman, Meghnad Saha, Chandrasekhar, and so many others. They were, and others, they were all connected to Indian tradition. They knew in whatsoever way, not in a formal way, because the British about 200 years ago shut down India's own education system, and for about 100 years India became literally illiterate, 4 or 5%, as Dharampal has shown in his wonderful book, The Beautiful Tree. And then, of course, slowly people got through the college system, 1, 2, 3, 4%. By the time they left, the British left, the literacy rate was maybe 10%. And an amusing sidelight to this is that when the Indian education system, Indian education service to parallel Indian civil service was set up by the British, in 1920, there were 120 scientists in the Indian education service, out of whom 200, out of whom 194 were British. There were only 6 Indians who were found fit enough to be a part of the Indian education service to do sciences and so on. But now we know that the whole situation is changed all over the world. No matter what university you go, that's not what the situation is. But the specific point here I'm making is that after 47, since we decided to separate ourselves from our own science traditions, Indian physicists do not know about Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras. Now, Kanada in his sutras speaks of 6 categories. 3 of them are Dravya, Guna, and Karma, which means there are substances and they have properties and they have motions. And so what Kanada says, that all that you see in the physical universe should be seeable in terms of substances, their properties, and their motions, which is exactly consistent with modern science, right? Everything in the physical universe, temperature, concepts like temperature depends on the energy, the motion of particles, and so on. But Kanada also speaks of three other categories, and these three categories are Samanya, which is universal, Vishesha, which are particular depending upon the observer, and Samavaya, which is where the observer is interacting with the observed. So in Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutra, there's already a clear emphasis on not only objects in what they are, but also the way the subject, the observer, interacts with the object. And it's that complex of the interaction and of physical reality as it is, which leads to our understanding and knowledge. Now, certainly the Samavaya is where, if one were to go back to philosophy, if we were to look at the physical universe as Prakriti, and the observer or the consciousness, the free mind, not the mind as reflective of one's own karmic change, colored by dvesh and raga and so on, but the sakshi within each one of us, right? We are talking of the observer as the sakshi, who is unalloyed, pure. So this is Shiva, of course, the interaction in the image of the Ardhanarishwara, for example, or in the dance where the image, the embodiment, and the principle come together. That is where the interaction takes place, and that is what Samavaya is. So where do we stand now? First of all, to me, it appears from whatever I know of modern physics, as well as of the Vedic tradition, that just as the crisis in 1920s was resolved by bringing in the observer as visualized and understood by Schrodinger, the Austrian Vedantin. And also there's another interesting sidelight to it, which is the second part of modern physics. The second part of modern physics, of course, is relativity theory. And we know that in 1896 or 1898, the most famous American physicist or engineer or man of science was Nikola Tesla. And Sarah Bernhardt, the great French actress, with a troupe, was visiting the US, and she was in New York, and she threw a party. And Vivekananda was very famous, Tesla was very famous, and Sarah Bernhardt wanted to bring Tesla and Vivekananda together. And we have record of their interaction. We have record in terms of letters that Vivekananda wrote about their meeting, and also entry made by Tesla in his diary. So apparently what Vivekananda told Tesla was that, look, I know that you're interested in, you have these visionary ideas of connecting everybody through energy transmitted wirelessly, and the engineering of it is very difficult. We don't have the physics at this particular point, which is late 19th century, to do it. He says, but look, according to Vedic science, and what he apparently meant was Vaisheshika, it should be possible to convert mass into energy. So he says, he told Tesla, this is what Vivekananda told Tesla. He says, why don't you find an equation for conversion of mass into energy? And once you do that, both your efforts would reach fruition, and it will also establish Vedic science on a footing so that it will be more acceptable to the West. Now, we know that Tesla himself failed at doing it, but there are some people, some American historians who have speculated that since Tesla was the most famous Serbian of his time, Einstein's first wife was Serbian, it's possible that Tesla, in their communication, somehow this effort or this search got communicated to the Einsteins, and And the paper, Einstein's wife herself was a physicist, and the most famous paper on relativity, originally, we know, had both Albert and his wife's name as co-authors. It's only when the proofs came in that Einstein took his wife's name off the authorship. And therefore, this idea could have played a role. And we also do know that when Einstein and his wife got divorced, one of the terms was that should Einstein win the Nobel Prize, all the money will go to his wife. And when he did win the Nobel Prize, he only held to half of this promise. He gave her only half of the prize, not the full prize, as was a part of the settlement, which is interesting story. Okay, so here's where we stand. There's a tremendous crisis. This crisis is not only about dark matter and dark energy. This crisis in physics is also about observer, because now people are exploring this further. Now we can look at the brain machine. We also have computers, which are silicon machines. Silicon machines are not conscious. The brain machine is conscious. So this is another big paradox and challenge. Why is the brain machine conscious while the silicon machine is not conscious? And if the silicon machine can be made conscious, the whole universe would be changed. Why? Because if computers were to become conscious, as many scientists believe in, and I've been a part of these discussions at the highest level in the US, where all the leading scientists have come together, paid for by DARPA. Now, where is the future? Will computers become conscious? Because if computers become conscious, well, first of all, they'll have no use for human beings, right? They'll say, these are pesky little creatures. We'll run the world ourselves. And there are half the scientists who believe that computers will become conscious. I think they will not become conscious, because I think Vedanta really shows the way that as perceived within this whole complex, the para and apara, you have the two interact, and we are conscious because we are also Shiva, right? But they are also apart. It's a very interesting paradoxical thing. It's paroksha, because everything, all logical knowledge is limited. Modern scientists also are quite aware of that. All logical knowledge is limited, and which is why in the moral universe also you have paradoxes, which is why with people who are ideologues, they say, why don't you have this perfect justice? There's no perfection in moral order, because so long as you're using narratives, there will be oppositions of one kind or the other. And these oppositions in logic itself, as we know from the work of Russell and Wittgenstein, or go back in the Indian tradition, you go look at Bhartrihari himself, speaking of these fundamental paradoxes. If you question, if you say you're a liar, then are you a liar? Because then if you say I'm always a liar, then you've already become truthful, and so it's paradoxical. There are fundamental set theoretic oppositions that there exist. In fact, I should also say that the very foundations on which modern world is, scientific world or technological world is based, has so many Indian threads and Indian currents. I mentioned quantum mechanics, but another thread, and I also mentioned Vivekananda, another thread is the whole computer science theory, which is based on mathematical logic. The story there, of course, is that mathematical logic was created by three Englishmen, Charles Babbage, Augustus de Morgan, and George Boole in the 1850s. Now, George Boole died, I think, in the 1860s. He was quite young. And George Boole's wife, Mary Boole, was a science writer in the 1800s. And in 1898, she wrote a famous essay where she wrote about the history of the discovery by these three, which had not at that point changed the world. It was to change the world in the 20th century, right? As logic circuits were created and computers were created, even though Charles Babbage had already made a simulator for a mechanical computer, with program and so on. And even prior to that, as we know, Panini's Ashtadhyayi with its 4,000 rules, with meta rules, is structurally, as Fritz Stahl and many other scholars have argued, is equivalent to a Turing machine, to a computer program. But here, in 1898, Mary Boole wrote this famous essay, which is on the internet, you can all see it, where she says that, look, people are not giving credit to India for this discovery of mathematical logic because George Everest, the Surveyor General of India, after whom Mount Everest is now known, at least in the Western world, because the Nepalese call it Sagarmatha, right? They call it Sagarmatha. They don't call it Mount Everest. Like Indians do, because we are still totally colonized after 1947 in so many different ways. So Mary Boole says that, look, George Everest used to come to London from time to time, and these three belonged to his intellectual salon. And Everest would tell them about Navya Nyaya, which he had picked up in India. And as you know, Navya Nyaya arose in Bihar and Bengal about 1200 years ago. And Navya Nyaya is, according to all scholars, is equivalent to mathematical logic. You know, it's conditional logic. So it had already arisen within India, and Mary Boole did talk about it. And so this is this other amazing thread that we have, which ultimately, as we know, was to give rise to modern computers. And now we have all these questions about will computers become conscious and what will they do to the world. So where we stand now, what appears to me as a possibility, in fact, not just possibility, a most likely thing is that the resolution to the current difficulties that we have in science, both in neuroscience, brain science, or in AI, related to where consciousness comes in, and in physics, will be to give a greater role than has been given before to the observer. See, what happened in physics after the Second World War, quantum mechanics was created primarily in Germany, and with some contributions, say, from England, Paul Dirac, but really the heart was in Germany. You had Heisenberg, you had Schrodinger, and Heisenberg himself, when he came to Shantiniketan and he met with Rabindranath Tagore, I think in the late 1920s, he says, now I can understand what quantum mechanics really means, because Tagore, or Rabindranath Tagore, was telling him about, you know, Vedantin view of reality, which you know, it's so incredible. It's been so resilient in presence of all the changes that have taken place. So where we stand now, well, after the Second World War, there was a reaction to this framework which is called positivism in philosophy, where reality was not supposed to exist prior to its interaction by the observers. You know, that's positivism, that you cannot say the universe exists if there were no observers. So observers and the universe are two sides of the same coin, right? Consciousness and the physical, the Mahabhutas, are two sides to the same coin. So this is where Vedanta and the orthodox interpretation of quantum mechanics are consistent. But after the Second World War, when Germany had lost, and the Anglo-American reaction to this interpretation of quantum mechanics occurred, they said, no, you know, we cannot bring in observers. Humans must also be seen as quantum mechanical systems. So there's been tremendous effort at trying to develop that system, but it's come to naught, even though maybe 10-15% of the physicists are attracted to it. The predominant view in physics itself is that the orthodox interpretation is the right one, that consciousness is a category separate from materiality, that materiality and consciousness are two sides of the same coin, that, you know, you are the universe, as, you know, in those popular slogans which are made. Now, let me bring in a personal element to it. I personally, those of you who know my work, I work both in AI as well as in quantum mechanics. And a couple of years ago, when the pandemic started, I was stuck in Miami, which is where my children live. So, so there was, there was a lot of time, and one was wondering about this and that. And I was reflecting on this big crisis, a very specific crisis that has occurred in cosmology, on which you can read a Scientific American article called the Cosmological Crisis of Physics, where the crisis is this. I've already mentioned that there are that the universe is expanding at a certain rate, right? And you can measure it. And now that expansion is accelerating. So we do know that. Now, what they've discovered is that this, based on how you measure this acceleration, there are two irreconcilable figures. You can either measure this by means of background microwave radiation, which is a remnant of the Big Bang. Now, if you use it through that lens, you get a certain number, which is 67 in some units. But if, on the other hand, you look at various stars in the far universe, and the further off they are a representation of earlier in time. And therefore, even though you are only looking at the universe at this point in time, by looking at much further off, you can then simulate as to what the universe was at different points in time. So based on those measurements, the figure comes out to be different. So there is a difference of 10% or so, which after many, many efforts, they have not been able to reconcile. So inspired by Kanada, by Sheshik Sutra, the whole question, and it's a part of other Vedantic descriptions as well, the question that one can ask is the universe really three-dimensional? There's something that's not been questioned at all in the Western scientific tradition for the past 300-400 years, and which is that, going back to Descartes or Leibniz or Newton or even Einstein, that the universe is like a bucket, so to speak, in which three-dimensional bucket, in which all these objects, the stars, etc., have exploded and they're going far apart. But the container is three-dimensional, right? But why should, now of course Einstein made a slight change to it, that there are wrinkles on it. If there is mass, then the space-time gets curved. The idea came to me that what if the universe is not three-dimensional? And I've been working on some of these things, inspired partly by Navya Nyaya, and I came up with a theorem which I published last year, which argued that that firstly, binary logic, and this is not just my theorem, this has been known to scientists for a long time, that binary logic is not optimal, ternary logic is. Binary meaning yes, no, is not optimal. Ternary meaning yes, no, and the third category. And as we know, Western medicine is based on binary logic. You're well or you're not well. Indian medicine, Ayurveda, is based on ternary logic, right? There are three doshas, three kinds of doshas, or three kinds of gunas, right? So ternary and binary are different ways of looking at reality. But ternary is optimal if you're counting in integers. If you are counting not in integers, then E dimensionality, 2.718, is optimal. And so I published a theorem, and then suddenly the idea came to me, what if the universe itself is E-dimensional? It's fractal. It's not three-dimensional, it's E-dimensional. And I was able to resolve that paradox, that opposition that we have right now in these two different expansion rates. And I sent it to Nature Scientific Reports, and they published it. Then I was able to publish many other papers as well. And therefore, at least it's opened up the doorway to looking at universe in a way which is much more consistent with both Vaisheshika and Vedantic approaches to reality, which is that our constructions are made in our mind, that there is no, it's so easy to slip into this idea of objects or frame itself imagined as an object, as a three-dimensional superstructure, frame structure. But the Vedantic approach, which is where consciousness is primary, right? Everything emerges out of consciousness. You have wonderful episodes, narratives on it, also in Mahabharata or in Yoga Vasishta, and it's about how pralaya occurs, how during pralaya, or that sequence, first of all, the sun becomes larger and larger. Firstly, the Prithvi element becomes apaha, then that becomes tejas, that becomes vayu, and then it becomes akasha. There is a sequence, and ultimately, and this was the starting point of Vivekananda's conversation with Tesla, because in the Indian tradition, as even in the narratives in the Mahabharata or Yoga Vasishta, and certainly in the various sutras, that all of these Mahabhutas can transition under certain conditions, and ultimately it goes into Akasha, which is the carrier, so to speak, of Chetana. You have Bhautik Akasha, there's also Chitta Akasha and Chidakasha, the Akasha of Vishnu's imagination, or Akasha, or Chidambaram, if you view it from the perspective of Shiva. So all of this sequence is already a part of this understanding, and it appears to me that if physics were to look at further aspects of the observation process, in my view, as a physicist, if I were to wear that hat for a moment, the 96% of missing dark matter and dark energy is because of the way we are interacting with this world, the way we are interpreting the data that is being given to us. If we were able to, now we can't just throw it out and say that this data is nonsense. No, the data is all there, but we are not looking at it the right way, just as was happening in the 1920s. We had the data about the electrons and the protons, etc., the nucleus, but we are not interpreting it the right way. And once we were able to do it, that's when modern theory of chemistry came along, built upon quantum mechanics. So likewise, it appears to me, just as now, of course, my work on expansion of the universe, it's been published, but that doesn't mean that everybody's going to embrace it. Science is a conversation. This is an idea, the idea that the physical universe is not three-dimensional, it's e-dimensional, opens up something where now we have to carry out further studies and see whether it really hangs together and where does it take us. And if that is true, is our inner space in which our bodies are created, starting right from DNA, is that also e-dimensional? And it does turn out that's also e-dimensional. I have some preprints on that as well, that you can explain the structure of the DNA, you can explain its geometrical structure, and likewise the amino acids and the way they map into proteins, etc., also in this form. So that the main takeaway is that consciousness is going to play a greater role in unraveling the difficulties that we have right now. And what is required is for us to, first of all, be humble and step back, because in all of this, as Vedanta informs us, and as all sadhana informs us, it's the goddess who speaks through us, through every creative person. The moment somebody thinks that, hey, I am creating it, that's the end of creativity. Because I, meaning your mind, your embodied mind. Your embodied mind is cased within the structure of the ideology to which you are attached, or to which, because we are always attached to some ideology or the other in our journey, our embodied mind, the lens. But the moment you let go and go to the very heart, the very center of this complex, of this matrix, which is where you let the Devi speak through you, that's when you have new insights. And I think that's what's required. I think what is required, if I were to expand a little bit here, is for India to be more humble. After 1947, we rejected all of India's own logic, India's own knowledge, and perhaps there are still a lot of jewels there which are going to, looking through which jewels we'll be able to see much further off than has been done before. And George Sudarshan, good friend of Rukmaniji's as well, he saw that far because he was also a Vedantin. I think we must step away. It's not that we don't love the West. We also love the West. Western sages have also done wonderful stuff. We love the West, but what, as Vivekananda again said, what we need is a marriage of the two. We need the outer view, and we need to do it as properly, as devotion to excellence as is possible. We need to do that, but we also need to give greater respect to the inner view, which is the Vedantin or the yogic view, because these are all different darshanas on the same transcendent reality. And it's only when we do that, I think the whole universe, which is at a great crisis point, as you know, in the United States just last year, 90,000 young people died of opioid poisoning. Why are they dying? These are young people, wonderful, 30s, 20s, young children, great lives, because they see no sense in a world which is told to them by the media, by everybody else, has no sense to it, excepting, outer sensation-based gratification, which they have already gone through. So they get into these addictions. I say, which is what Vedanta says, that there is this whole new universe within us to be discovered, the various elements of which to be mapped. So this universe, this world is full of wonder, and that can be achieved only by a proper marriage of the two. So I think the time is for us, for India, to find its proper place. And I think Indian universities and professors should approach all of this with great humility, which they have not. I'm so shocked. A few years ago, 3-4 years ago, 5-6 years ago, this is at the Maha Kumbh at Ujjain. I was invited to be a speaker, and I was talking about some of these things, and there were 20,000 people under this huge tent. And I was talking to them about Schrodinger and Vedanta and all of this, which is, of course, a part of history of science, which everybody accepts, which is not made up. And after that, an Indian professor of physics came up and he says, how can you talk of it? Isn't this all made up? Indians are so ignorant. Indian universities know nothing of all of this. I think we need to reverse that, approach all of this knowledge with humility, but also with integrity. You don't just accept anything that anybody is saying. We're not talking of that at all. We are talking of shastras. We are not talking of fairy tales. So shastric knowledge, so that what that will do, rather than Indian philosophy itself having become provincialized by the West. Indian philosophy is given one small closet in this whole building of philosophy in Western universities. And that's unacceptable that should be unacceptable to Indian philosophy, because Indian philosophy should be center stage. Why? Because Indian philosophy gives equal place to consciousness. And this reality has two aspects, consciousness and physical reality. And I think Indian philosophy is the only thing that does it. So Indian philosophers must reclaim that center stage. And once that is done, because philosophy is a great partner to scientific exploration. So once that is done, I think that will create a revolution that will change physics, and which will help humanity resolve questions also of AI and what to deal with these challenging questions. So with this, I stop. Thank you very much for having given me this opportunity to speak at the Vedanta Congress.
Thank you so much, Subhashji, for this wonderful, enlightening talk, as always, and especially at this Vedanta conference where you were able to kind of marry to the earlier talk and Vedantic concepts that we don't get to hear very often. And I would like to kind of summarize a little more, but I already see there are so many questions. So I will, if you permit, maybe we can go to 3 or 4 questions, Subhashji.
Sure.
All right. So the first question is from Balramji, and he implicitly is taking some issue with your categorization of physics, giving rise to chemistry, which in turn gives biology. So his question is, assuming that biology is the basis of human existence, can physics exist without the biology of the observer?
Well, certainly not. You know, these are complementary views. There were no humans, there is no biology, then there won't be any discussion of Vedanta or physics or anything else. So these are different aspects, different ways of looking at reality. Certainly, we are also biological systems, right? We are also brains, and we also are conscious. Now, computers also see things, or they can create photographs of different places, but people would agree that they are not conscious because they don't have freedom. Or, you know, these questions can be raised from so many different perspectives. You could also say, okay, you have physical laws. If you have physical laws, then where does freedom come in from, right? Either we are all zombies, we don't have freedom, we imagine we have freedom. In fact, there is a book by Max Tegmark. He's a professor at MIT, and he is arguing that we are all zombies, that we don't have any freedom because reality is all mathematical. So our reality is also mathematical, and so there is no freedom at all. And then there are also neuroscientific experiments, such as the famous experiment by Libet, where you are asked to press a button, and at a certain point, freely, you know, you meaning a patient who's undergoing neurosurgery, so his brain is opened up, and they also have wired up the motor cortex corresponding to the finger. So they find the active potential going up a couple of 100 milliseconds prior, after the time that signals take to go from the brain to the finger tip has been accounted for, that these action potentials arise prior, 100 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds prior. So then the question, philosophical question that would arise is there any freedom? But, you know, while these experiments do create complications for philosophers of neuroscience, if you will, within the heart of each one of us, we are convinced, at least to each one of us, if not others, we are convinced that we are free. Each one of us is free. Sometimes we do wonder whether others that we interact with are free or not. Maybe they are robots, but we are truly free. So certainly, I mean, you can look at these things from so many different perspectives. And that's what the whole Indian Shastras tell us. You have different darshanas. You can look at them in terms of Sankhyan categories, or in terms of yogic categories, or Nyaya, logical categories, or from there you go to Navya Nyaya. We are also machines, so Nyaya to Navya Nyaya, right? But we also have that core, that Sakshi within us. And we know, as creative people, we know not just it's talking in a first-person basis. Jacques Hadamard, the famous French mathematician, wrote a book called The Logic of Mathematical Discovery or something like that. He wrote to the leading mathematicians and scientists of his time, and he asked them, how did you make your discovery? And they all said, not through inductive thought. We were either dreaming, or the idea suddenly came to me, or, or in Ramanujan's case, he would say, the goddess Namagiri would come to him. And that is just one way of saying that the formulas, which some mathematicians are still working on, 100 years after his death, and his diaries, just before he died, they were discovered 30 or 40 years ago. And mathematicians are still working on it and discovering amazing stuff for which there is no proper antecedent. So where does that math come from? And that itself seems to support the position that Utpal Deva or Abhinav Gupta, the great Kashmirian philosophers, took against Buddhist Yogacar philosophers, who said that everything is transitory, mind itself is transitory. So then Utpal Deva or Abhinav Gupta said, if it's transitory, if you imagine your memory of 5 years ago and now, what is it that is holding them together? So there should be some entity which holds them together, and that's what is Shiva. That is how the idea of Shiva became so powerful right after Shiva Sutra. But as I have argued, you can go back to Shvetashvatara Upanishad, you can go back to the Rig Veda itself, you can go back to Rudra and Agni, as consciousness. So the way, in my view, the way all of these have been explained or described in the Indian curriculum is totally wrong. And I totally agree with the famous statement made by a scholar whom I respect a lot, Ananda Kumaraswamy, who was half English, as you know, and half Sri Lankan, who in the 1930s or early 40s wrote at one place that literally everything that you read described by Western scholars and then Indian followers about Hinduism is wrong. This is what he said. I have the exact quote, which I'll be happy to share with Sukalyan, and he can share it with others. He says that literally everything that you read about that is wrong. And I subscribe to that. It's not wrong in a surface sense. If you look at Chomskyan categories, you have surface structure and deep structure. Surface sense, yeah, it all seems right, lexical, a lot of information, but it misses the true meaning. It misses the heart of it. And I do agree with that.
Thank you so much, Subhashji. And I know we have run out of time, but with your permission again, we will ask one more question of you. And this is regarding to what you were talking about in the Vaisheshika system. So the Vaisheshika system finally culminated with two more substances, seventh Atman and eighth Manas. How are Atman and Manas then associated with consciousness and further with physics?
Well, Manas is an inner instrument. It's the inner instrument. It's constructed out of our embodied self. Atman is consciousness, right? In Shiva Sutra, what was it? The very first sutra is something related to it. I forget it right now. Atman is consciousness, right? Manas is, you can view it as the prakasha. Shiva is the prakasha, right? And Manas is the vimarsha, the lighting, the lighting that takes place in the embodiment, right? And so they are a pair, and that is that samavaya that I was talking about, where the two must come together. In any event, those of you who want to read more about Vaisheshik Sutra, I did translate the Vaisheshik Sutra. It's a book called Matter and Mind, where you'll find the original Sanskrit plus the translation plus a commentary, where you can see different aspects of it.
Thank you so much, Subhashji. Thank you so much. And I know, I'm so sorry, there are some more questions, but we have run out of time and we want to start our next session also in time. So again, thank you both to Rukmaniji and Subhashji for this wonderful setting up of day 2 of this conference. And as many of viewers have said, we would like to have them again and again and again. So with gratitude, thank you. And we will have our next session at 8 o'clock IST. And